been refining the system for decades, but what if it's time to redesign it? Not from scratch, but from what we know works. You're listening to Education by Design. I'm your host, Phil Evans. This episode is all about the stories that we tell in our school communities. Stories that empower or exclude. Stories that shape culture, and because they're defined by our lived experiences, hold incredible power and value. We're going to hear from Dr. Heather Michael, a teacher, leader, and researcher from Halifax, Nova Scotia in Canada. Heather has investigated how students make choices about their education through the lens of spatial theory. Heather's research reveals how community narratives, whether they're about academic programs, family roles, or social barriers, can profoundly affect students' sense of possibility. While some of our conversation touches on the International Baccalaureate context, the insights you'll hear apply to any school that grapples with equity, belonging, and culture as we seek to raise expectations for all students. Before applying spatial theory to her research, Heather sought to find out how students understood their learning experience.
That was interesting to me because what I found was the questions we were asking weren't exactly what the students needed in order to conceptualize beyond the tasks that they were. So with some reframing, instead of asking students, for example, tell me about your extended essay, if we reframe the question to tell me about your research process, you hear a story of a student's identity as a researcher as opposed to this is the paper that I wrote. So my research is based on spatial theory and the idea that a space is greater than a geographic location, that there's stories that exist in spaces. A parallel I would give is there's an energy for a classroom teacher that exists with every particular class and its configuration. If you teach third grade, there's an energy, there's stories that exist in that space, and when the school year's over, that energy's gone. That space changes into something else. And it can become something else, but the narrative, this class is like this. Our energy here is like this. Same thing for people who are in a play. The day after the play is over and you start to pull the set, it feels very different than it did while that play was still happening. And another example that resonates with a lot of people is if you lose a family member or a friend and go back into the space where they lived, you can feel that there's a shift. So that's sort of the essence of part of spatial theory, is the idea that the space has a story and that story is quite strong. And so one of the biggest mistakes we make as educators is we assume and center the school as part of the experience of the students we teach. And for some students, the school is central to how they conceptualize themselves, but for some, it's not. And often the students who don't centralize the school are the students who also are somehow marginalized in some capacity.
So if a student feels that real life happens outside the classroom, that can shape whether they believe that the type of wonderful education we want to provide for them, or even school itself, is for them. As Heather points out, we can't take for granted that students see the school as their core community space. We have to ask and listen. Heather points out that the language of schooling is sometimes the deterrent itself. When the stories we perpetuate are focused more on tasks than on opportunities, students don't see how they can shape their identity as researchers and thinkers.
I think where we fail with the diploma is that many of us pick up the language of assessment, and I'm guilty of that too. When people say, well, what does it look like? It's very easy to jump in and say, well, you're going to do this, this, and this. You're going to write these exams your senior year in May, and then you're going to move forward, when actually that's the wrong place to start. And so if we're talking about equity, it means that we're talking about power. And the question becomes in a school, who has power? Who's the dominant culture? Who gets to participate? And who's on the margins? Who isn't part of that group? And and I don't think this is an exclusive to IB problem, but when you have programs to opt in, what happens is students try and figure out, well, which of those paths reflects who I am and who I hope to be. And so if that choice is made for students based on academics, based on socioeconomics, do students have to pay? Do students have to change schools? Do students have to write entrance tests? Do they have to keep certain marks? That is a privilege that a lot of students can't even envision in their life. I recently interviewed a student who was talking about how when she was 12, she realized if she was going to go to university, she had to pay for it all herself. And so she knew she could start working at 14, and she did, and she spent 40 to 60 hours working through most of her high school career. So for her, a super capable student, she was able to do an IB certificate in Lang and Lit, but she couldn't even conceptualize the idea of doing the diploma because the trade-off for time for her was too great. And I think that's a story of how, in many ways, the cycle of poverty can perpetuate itself. She didn't feel that she could afford the time because she's buying groceries for her family and working, and can't even imagine a step beyond high school without having X number of dollars in the bank that she's earning with a minimum wage job. And so we look at that story of an incredibly capable student, and it makes me think, okay, what do we as thinkers and leaders in this organization need to do to create a context where that student would see herself as being a potential candidate? And is it that, and I realize I'm talking about issues that are bigger than simply an academic choice, an academic experience, when we're talking about larger systemic issues of inequity, and yet that is what we have to talk about if we're going to explore equity and inclusion in an IB setting.
So how do we begin to change these stories in practical ways? Or as Richard Hood pointed out in our last episode, it might be arrogant to say that we can even do that, but how do we disrupt them? Heather points to the messy, iterative nature of shifting culture.
In any school, and I would say this based on observations across several schools, the teachers and the administrators also reinforce a narrative of which students belong in a course and which students don't. And that's the nature of how it goes. So that story that lives in the community also lives in the building. It lives in the building among current students. It lives in the building among current administrators and with teachers. And so to do the work, everybody all at once isn't necessarily ready because everybody has to shift thinking. And with equity work, it also requires checking our own power. So as a program coordinator, I have to check my power, my privilege. Who am I reinforcing? Who am I supporting? Who am I missing? So do teachers, so do administrators. So it becomes really important to say, are my practices inclusive? Is my classroom allowing all of my students to see themselves as being part of this? Am I teaching the same way I have always taught, or am I seeing myself grow and change as a teacher to differentiate the work I'm doing for all of my students to be seen and feel seen? And so I think for me, I definitely had to change some things. And I think that it's important to acknowledge we all have biases in terms of our teaching. We all have biases in terms of the students who are easier for us to work with. And it's a matter of doing I think teachers have to do some real personal work about saying, okay, who am I missing? What are my go-to strategies, and do I need to mix those up a little bit? How am I doing the work myself? So there's multiple planes that have to simultaneously be operational in order for this work to nudge forward. So there needs to be work in communities, there needs to be work with teachers, and it needs to not be sort of a one-off PD on a Tuesday. It needs to be sort of a constant dialogue. There's got to be wraparound support for the students who are at the front, and that's also really like precarious work, because the students who are willing to take a risk after you get that buy-in, you have to protect them, because they're going into a space that is maybe not that comfortable for them.
We know that schools operate in such complicated contexts where meeting the needs of every student is an ongoing battle every single day. And yet understanding the stories that we're telling in our communities is the key to rewriting them.
So my research was about what is it when these students are in grade 9 in their junior high, so our school starts in grade 10, what is happening in their lives across that year, their last year of junior high, and how is that shaping their understanding of themselves, who they're about to be when they go into high school, and whether or not they're going to opt into some IB programming. And what I found was that, because the only thing they have to do is on a course selection sheet, they check a box. There's literally nothing else in the way. And what I found was the predominant overarching determinant for students was the stories they hear. And the stories they hear about, oh, well, that program is for kids from that other school. We don't do that. And regardless of the description of the student, their capabilities, that wasn't for them. And so in some respects, it was almost a redesigning of a geographical barrier, because students felt, oh, I'm from this neighborhood, that's not for me. So at a very practical level, when I'm working with students, often I get them to draw a map of the spaces where they spend time. And some students will put the school and they'll talk about how it's important. But some students don't even include it. They don't even think to include it, because though they spend quite a bit of time there, when they think about the places that are important to them, the school isn't part of it. And so I think our error as educators is, for many of us, we've centralized school. It's our profession, it's our lives. We've probably performed school well, many of us. And the discourse and language of school came easy to us. We understood what was there for us. And even if we didn't at some point in our academic career, we figured it out at some point, because we've made a choice to centralize schooling as part of our professions. Some of the students who we work with and families, they value education that happens in other places. And I don't think that's a less than, I think it's a different. And so when we're starting to work with people who we feel haven't sort of bought into what we're trying to provide, I think part of it is we have to say, well, where does school fit in your understanding of where you learn? And if a student says, well, yeah, I mean, I do my assignments, I just want to get out of there because I want to get to this other thing, that's when we have to say, okay, what is this other thing, and how do we, bring those two things together?
A single step in this kind of direction can transform a student's identity. Our success can be measured when a student says, I can do challenging coursework in at least one subject that I love. So what do we need to think about if we're going to untangle all of these different stories that feed into what students understand about their possibilities?
People's lived experiences need to be valued in this. So if you have a teacher, for example, who wholeheartedly believes that the IB is only for particular people, that teacher is not going to come around if you say you're wrong and no, it can be for everyone. Because the lived experience might be that it's been for a particular group of students, and so their total knowledge of IB is within this particular framing. So I think it's really important that we meet everybody where they are. And if we think of this less as beliefs and more as stories, we can all have a different story of what IB means in our school and in our community. And then it's about saying, well, where are we in that story and what's next? And the next chapter in any story can change. A story can change over time, but it doesn't happen immediately.
One of the things I like the most about what Heather uncovers is that we have to become comfortable with ambiguity.
Every school has a different issue when it comes to thinking about equitable access. For some, it's students from particular neighborhoods. For some, it's students from particular demographics. For some, it's supporting students who are neurodivergent in particular ways. And so I think the thing that makes this work complicated is that it's contextual. And every school context, year over year, is different. And so when we're starting to think about what the IB can do and what schools can do, it's a matter of forging your own flexibility. Where can you create spaces that allow for flexibility in an experience that does have some rigidity? And you can't discount that. It's part of the merits of IB is achieving some milestones that require being uncomfortable, require the work. And I don't think we should be conflating flexibility with simple or making something easier. I think what we have to do is create a context where individual schools and the IB have different ideas, collections of resources that are like, okay, we had this problem, we tried this. Almost like a catalog of equity ideas or a catalog of strategies for equity. Because I think what happens is schools are such insular places in so many ways, and yet at the same time we're trying to make this IB experience that has some sort of commonality across the world. And I think the work actually is a lot messier. It has to happen on the ground, and you have to be prepared to make a lot of mistakes along the way.
What Heather says next really impresses me the most. It's about applying the same level of empathy and belief that we have for students to caring for adult learners.
Everybody has to be open to a new idea. Students, families, teachers, school leaders. And regardless as to where you are on the path, everybody has to be open to that new idea changing. What is easy to do is be dismissive of the teachers who are resistant to it. Because you want to say like, well, how can you not see this? But actually, I think what is really important is that there's constant dialogue about what this looks like, about what kind of support we can provide, about who's excluded, who's included. And it's about what strategy works, what scaffolding works, because at the end of the day, whatever strategies we put in to diversify our classrooms helps all of our students. So it's about understanding that learning can look really different for every student in our classroom. And it's about supporting teachers so that they feel like they have the time and the space to think and the conversations with other people about how all of our students can be successful. The biggest currency for this work is time for teachers, and certainly that's a struggle. It's a struggle in our context. I think it's a struggle for a lot of teachers because it is not a small ask to have a teacher particularly a teacher who's well established in their career and has been successful with their teaching and with IB for a period of time, to say, okay, we know you have done this really well for a really long time, and now we want you to do it differently. Like, that's a big ask, because what they have been doing in the framework that many of us had for success in IB has been successful. So I think we also have to be careful, because if we believed IB was this, and I'm a teacher who's worked really hard towards this, and then somebody's coming in and telling me, no, we want it to be over here, like, that's also a really disruptive experience. And so I think that the work needs to be, we need to consider everybody's identity, not just the identity of the students, because teachers' identities are so wound up in the work, that we are all wound up in the work that we do, because, or many of us are, I'm speaking for myself, I guess, because part of who I am as an individual is really deeply connected to the work that I do. And I think that holds true for a lot of educators. So I think change and kind of moving these spaces to be closer together, it has to be iterative. The steps need to be small, and we have to be open. Everybody, including the leader of the equity work, what I thought was going to be the outcome and what I desired as the outcome when I began to do more equity work in my school is not at all what it looks like now. And if I had kept my ego attached to that initial conception, then I wouldn't have gotten anywhere.
Some listeners might be wondering why Heather works so hard to convince students that they should see themselves in an international baccalaureate education. It's a great question. I asked Heather what those values are, and I think that whether or not you're in an IB school, you'll see that these values align to what we want for any student.
When I describe an IB education to students and families, I talk about the benefit of being in the subject is that you get to become a scientist. You get to become an artist. We're not going to give you a list of a task. It's not a recipe for you to follow. It's not a fill in the blank kind of repeat after me. You have to figure out, how do I take this subject I've learned? How do I take the methodology of the subject, and how do I take my interests and meld those things together? And I think, for example, in the diploma or in the certificates, the internal assessment in every course is about generating new knowledge. We're asking students in each of those subjects to choose a topic and connect it to the process of the subject that you've learned. That's really powerful work, because often students don't get the opportunity to do that until they're higher level researchers in their undergraduate programming or graduate programming. We're empowering students to say, you can do this work, you can create a new idea. We're going to teach you the methods, the rules of your subject, and then it's up to you to say, okay, how do I take something that I see every day and turn it into knowledge? And that, to me, that's really exciting and important work. The reason why I think the IB education model is valuable for all students is it gives them the opportunity to make authentic connections to their lived experiences through the work they do and ultimately the assessment that they do. The challenge that exists is that if students don't see what that can look like, they don't see themselves as having authentic experiences that can be replicated in the IB. So it's a bit of a cart horse issue. If you don't have students from, say, a particular neighborhood participating, doing work where their friends or their peers or their younger siblings can see them, like doing an assignment where they're pulling on their love of video games or their passion for basketball or their community engagement, then you don't get the perpetuation of that cycle of, oh, I see myself, I see them using our community, using their interests in school.
It's clear by now that this work isn't just about working with students, it's not just working with teachers, it's working across the entire community to understand the stories that we're telling. Listening to the way that Heather applies spatial theory to the stories that students have, that we have as adults, that we bring into community spaces like schools, and how they influence each other, has really made me think about how important it is that students do see themselves in the learning every single day, so that that rich learning experience becomes something that they are leveraging in the lives that they live beyond their high school experiences. I hope you can also see how practical this can be to help us to understand how we're going to contribute to better narratives that students tell themselves about who they are and what they're capable of.
I think first we have to disrupt them. So it's about disrupting the stories that exist in spaces. Bell Hooks talks a lot about this in some of her work, in that a space and a story in a space can be disrupted, it can be interrupted, and it can be transformed. And I think what we need to do is see what's the narrative, what's the story, and of those stories, which ones need to be disrupted a little bit, which ones do we want to perpetuate. And I think when we think about an IB community, one of the things that graduates will often talk about is, oh, we were such a tight-knit community. And that's a wonderful thing for the students who are part of it, and extraordinarily alienating for the ones who aren't. So I think if we're going to do equity work, we need to say, okay, what does it look like to create, what does it look like for students when they're coming through to be part of a community? And what's the work we do as a school to kind of forge that? And because that close-knit group can be very othering if you're not in it. And I mean, we can step back. Every high school movie has that sort of cliche, am I part of the group, am I not? But when the binding of the group is this academic experience that everybody in the room is going through, then actually it's really important that everybody feels part of that.
You've been listening to the Education by Design podcast. I've been your host, Phil Evans. If you like this episode, please hit subscribe or follow, and join me for my next episode. And until next time, keep on learning.